Hi, today I'm going to walk you through my implementation for the Unreal Shooter project in Unreal Engine 4 and Wwise. Before I start, here's a list of everything I'll be going over in this video with timestamps, so you can skip forward if you want. Firstly, the ambiences and environmental sounds. The interior ambience is triggered on the player overlapping these trigger boxes, which are placed in each of the interior spaces. Once the player stops overlapping them, the exterior ambience fades in over 1 second, while the interior ambience fades out over 1 second as well. Since the player always spawns in an interior space, it works here to tie both of the ambience to just these trigger boxes. The ambience themselves have a bass loop and then intermittent sounds that play at random intervals, with some randomized volume, pitch, and panning using this automation. I also attached some howling wind and intermittent vehicle flybys to this spline that was already in the project, so that when you go up to the railing and look out of the map, you can hear things happening in the distance. These pickups for ammo and health have a custom blueprint that has a bass looped sound, then the Wwise event that plays the picked up sound also stops the loop. Then the respawn event in Unreal starts it again. This means that the pickup sound will only play when the pickup is actually used, rather than just when the player overlaps it. So for example, if the player is at full health, they can't trigger the health pickup sound because the item isn't actually being used. Lastly, for the environments, there's the reverb. I just have two reverbs, an exterior and interior, and they're both made using AK reverb volumes, which are placed in the same areas as these trigger boxes from earlier. In Wwise, I'm then attaching these auxiliary sends with the reverbs on to the AK reverb volumes, and making sure that most of the sounds are routed to the auxiliary volumes, other than things like pickups because they're non-diegetic. Moving on to the guns, both the rifle and launcher's firing sounds are split into different parts and triggered on these blend containers. This is partially so each shot has a more believable variation and randomness, but it also means that I can modulate each part separately. For example, the low transient here has less pitch variation than the mech layers, so it retains that more powerful low fundamental. And the body layer of both guns is delayed slightly, sometimes with a little bit of random variation to the delay, so that each shot has a more complex and satisfying sound. The reload sounds follow a similar concept where the animations have multiple clear actions to them, like removing the magazine, then placing in a new one. So I broke up each action into separate random containers and triggered them separately in the Unreal Animation blueprint using AK Anim Notifies. Next, I'm using a state here to change the sound of the gunshots when the player is aiming down sights, which I'm just triggering in Unreal by setting the state when the player presses and releases right-click, alongside playing a short sound when they initially scope in. The volume balance between the gunshot layers is then changed by this state, so that the player hears more mech and less tail when they're scoped in, and a bit more body when they're firing from the hip. Speaking of tails, both guns have separate tail sounds for interior and exterior spaces, which are triggered independently using a custom notify in the Unreal Animation blueprint. This is because I was having trouble getting sounds triggered by AK Anim Notifies to respond to switch changes, so my workaround was to trigger them in the blueprint, then actually set an RTPC in Unreal that then changes the switch from exterior to interior, which got it working. Next, I used ducking to make the gunshots stand out and make sure that the tails weren't overpowering the transients when you're shooting long bursts. By routing sounds to these buses, I was able to use the output of weapon main bus to duck the background bus, which has things like ambient beds and foley routed into it as well as the tails. For the rifle specifically, I have these surface-based impacts that are triggered using a sphere trace at the point of impact, which finds the surface type and sets an RTPC, which is connected to a switch container. Again, I'm using that workaround for the switches here. There's also a bullet ricochet sound that has a 20% chance of playing on top of the regular bullet impacts. The rifle also has shell casings that fly out when you fire it, and for these I'm using panning automation just to give each one a slightly different trajectory when they're played. The launcher has an in-air loop for the rockets and different explosion variations depending on the distance from the player. The rocket hit event stops the in-air loop and plays a close explosion sound if it's within a certain distance, and a far explosion sound if it's further than that. So this was done using attenuation, and the curves for both explosions have this ramp that kind of extends over both of them so that the explosion sound gets quieter the further away it is, regardless of which variation is playing. There's also a debris sound that plays if it explodes particularly close to the player. So that's everything for this project. Thanks for watching.